Good evening, fight fans. You are listening to a Radulich Broadcasting premier podcast, The History of Heavyweight Championship Boxing. We are in our final chapter, the epilogue, as it were, Modern Times. I'm your host, the mandated reporter, and frankly, I'm mortified, Mr. Mark Radulich, and the man who's been on this journey with me, and we'll continue to look at the greater history of boxing as we continue to do these shows in the months to come. Well, ladies and gentlemen, totally 80s, the punchy pugilist, Mr. Pat Mullin. How do you do, sir?
Good evening.
I know it's not Miller time, because you're not drinking Miller. It's something, sans something or other time.
It's Narragansett time tonight.
Narragansett, yes, sir. How many you pound before we start the show tonight?
I don't know. There's you put the beer in the coconut and throw the can away.
That's the lime, sir. You put the lime in the coconut.
Not according to Homer J. Simpson.
Fair enough. So, Pat, when we started this journey 16 chapters ago, 16 podcasts ago, the question was, at the time we were talking about the fights between Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder. And in the subsequent year or so that we were doing this, a lot of things have changed. But we initially had started with, there were a lot of people out there, specifically with Deontay Wilder, just talking about how he was the next great heavyweight champion, and he was this blossoming star, and that he was this great boxer. And me, you, and Robert, in our alternative commentaries of his fights, were really critical of Deontay Wilder. And the question that arose with reference to him, and then to a lesser degree Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, was how do the three best heavyweights of modern times stack up to their predecessors, going all the way back to Jack Johnson? You know, how has the sport evolved? Where are they in terms of, where are they to a greater degree the rest of the heavyweight division in terms of technique and power and stature and all of those things that we've talked about with other previous heavyweights? And so that's where we are tonight. You know, we're going to answer that question. Do the modern heavyweights of today stack up to their predecessors of yore? And we're going to start with Deontay Wilder. First, let me ask you, when you think about the modern heavyweights just in general, what are your thoughts vis-a-vis their predecessors?
As far as who we're looking at now versus who we looked at in the past, there's a disconnect for sure. There's a disconnect in the quality of fighter we look at. There's a disconnect in the grounds for becoming a fighter at a certain point in time. And for all the advances we've made in training techniques and equipment and all these things and giant steps forward, we've lost some things along the way that have made great fighters of the past great. And that's why today, we have far more champions because there are 4 recognized sanctioning bodies, but we have fewer real greats. And that's largely the issue, is that anybody today can be a champion, but are you a great fighter?
It's a very good point. If you go back to Muhammad Ali's title, there was one singular heavyweight champion. And when you talk about what made that era great, and we brought this up on those podcasts when we talked about Ali and the scramble for Ali's title and all of that, was not only was there a single unified recognized heavyweight champion that the world could point to and say, that's the guy, but everybody in that division were good to great, and they all fought each other, which is not a thing that happens now. It's one, as you said, you're considered a unified champion if you have 2 out of the 4 belts, number one. Number two, you can not only be a champion, but then you can be a super champion or an interim champion or a champion in recess, And then there's all these different subcategories within each division alone. You have gold and silver and platinum, and you have Latin American and African and Pan American, and then you have European and British, and it just goes on and on and on. So it becomes diluted. It becomes harder to see. I mean, right now as we record this podcast, we are gearing up for a late summer bout between Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury. And Tyson Fury is the recognized lineal heavyweight champion. He's the man that beat the man. But he's also the WBC champion after besting Deontay Wilder. Then you have Anthony Joshua, who has all the rest of the belt. But he has, in terms of the WBA, he has the super WBA belt. And who's got the regular belt? Trevor Bryan.
Because when the WBA has a champion who then unifies the regular WBA championship with another belt, they then recognize them as the WBA super champion and create another belt for the regular champion.
Right. And then you have...
and then you can go ahead and challenge the Klingons for interstellar dominance.
Then there's Dillian White, who's the interim WBC champion. And this just goes on and on. And now they're talking about Joe Joyce versus Alexander Usyk for an interim, I think it's either WBO or IBF belt. WBO belt, right. So this just gets ridiculous. And I know neither one of us really like that aspect of it. I think that's the other problem with this is that you do get some halfway decent fights out there. We just had the two back-to-back sort of Povetkin, Dillian White fights. And so you do get, some pretty decent fights out there. Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz fought back-to-back when you had the exchanges of titles between them. But it's harder and harder to get the guys in the division to, the best guys in the division to fight each other. I mean, right after Dillian White won back his title from Povetkin, people were talking about him fighting Deontay Wilder. And then Deontay Wilder put on a fake mustache and a top hat and a monocle and said, I don't know who this Deontay Wilder is you're talking about. I don't know, Suddenly, he just dove into a hole, and no one can find Deontay Wilder, who hasn't fought since Tyson Fury knocked him out, and instead has just made a litany of excuses. So let's talk about said Deontay Wilder, who was, again, a big part of what generated this entire podcast. When you look at Deontay Wilder, Pat, you see his size, you see his strength. He lacks in technique. Compared to the Alis of the world, the Alis of history, compared to... you can't really compare him to Tyson. Tyson was shorter than the average heavyweight, and so I think it's really two different conversations. But some of your bigger heavyweights that we've talked about, how does Deontay Wilder line up against his peers?
Not well. And people are going to be like, well, how can you say that? He was a champion and he made X amount of defenses. That's fine, but if you look at who he's fought on his record, the only real fighter of note that he has a win over is Luis Ortiz. And to compound that, we don't to this day know exactly how old Luis Ortiz is, and he's a guy who's been popped for using steroids while having a gut, which means I can fight, I don't like to train. The only other heavyweight of note he's fought is Tyson Fury, who humiliated him in their last bout, and in their prior fight, Fury was off a 4-year layoff or so. I forget the exact amount of time, but he was off a significant layoff where he dealt with minor things like cocaine addiction, bipolar disorder, and suicide and obesity, and came back and pretty much won 9 out of 12 rounds against Wilder, only to get jobbed on a draw. You look at Anthony Joshua's record comparative to Deontay Wilder, and the level of opposition that they've fought is shockingly just desperate between the two, because Joshua's fought the majority of the best of the heavyweight division and beaten them.
So, yeah, the Deontay Wilder's last couple of fights here, he's the one, the aforementioned Tyson Fury loss. the win over Luis Ortiz, which we talked about, where he was losing that fight up until the knockout in the 7th round. He KO'd Dominic Breazeale in 1 round, but I think you had even had some issues with that fight, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, Breazeale could have gotten up and just chose not to.
Okay. And then
and again, to the point with Breazeale, who people at one time had hopes for, he had pretty much the life beaten out of him by Anthony Joshua prior to this.
So not exactly a game opponent.
No.
And so then you have the Tyson Fury fight again, and then now we're into 2018, and we have the first Luis Ortiz fight, which he gets TKO in the 10th round. And before that is Berman Stavern in 2017. So yeah, there are some names here and there on his record, but there's a Chris Arreola who's about to fight Andy Ruiz in a pay-per-view, which is a weird one.
Yeah, if we're going to condemn Deontay Wilder for fighting a used-up and over-the-hill Chris Arreola at this point, what does it say about Andy Ruiz that he's fighting the same guy, 5 years later?
They are desperately trying to make something of Andy Ruiz. That's what that is, but we can talk about that later. So what is wrong with Deontay Wilder's technique, especially compared to some of the guys that we've talked about on past podcasts? Because he's a tall, lanky guy, but I think our biggest criticism of him is he doesn't really use his length at all. He doesn't really use his reach. He's sort of dependent on his power, and it's done well for him outside of the Fury loss. Most of his wins are he has 42 wins, and 41 of them are by knockout. So he is known for his power, to say the least. The problem is he's a little too over-dependent on it, and he compensates with said strength by because he has that lack of technique. Where in the technique department, what are his deficits?
He, again, like you said, he does not know how to maximize his gifts of height and range. He has no idea how to realistically maximize the use of those. In terms of his body dimensions, again, when he delivers his right-hand knockout punch, in order to do it, he has to take like a hop step forward to throw it and have that devastating effect with it. He can't just rely on a nice body pivot and throw the straight right hand down the pipe. He has to take a hop step to really telegraph that it's coming and then deliver it in an overarching angle fashion. Against somebody like Tyson Fury, who has a brain, 9 times out of 10, that punch is not going to land. And when he does that, he's not known for coming back with anything behind it because he's so reliant on that one punch to just do the job and end the night. He doesn't have any real instincts about fighting on the inside, so we haven't seen him against a great inside fighter, to be fair. We saw whenever he would have Tyson Fury on the ropes, he was largely ineffective and couldn't land anything because he doesn't know how to set punches up. He looks desperately for that big bomb to throw it and often gets countered very easily when he's confused. He doesn't utilize a tremendous amount of upper body movement or even foot movement to avoid punches, and that's how he ends up getting caught. That first fight with Luis Ortiz was life and death for him, where he was hurt very badly and almost knocked out, and fortunately was able to call on that power to stop Ortiz late in that fight. In the second fight, he was largely being outboxed just because he doesn't really know how to box. He knows how to throw a right hand. But the great Teddy Atlas will always talk about you can have this nuclear deterrent of a weapon, but if you don't have a delivery system for it, it's worthless. And Wilder, oftentimes almost by accident, has been able to throw his jab as a blinder and time a right hand behind it, but there hasn't been any consistency of him doing that would make you confident that he knows what he's doing when that happens. It's almost more a happy accident for him. And again, his hand speed is average for a heavyweight. He doesn't really possess a great hook. People will point to when he knocked down Tyson Fury in the 12th round of their fight that he came back with a left hook after he'd landed the right hand. But if you look at Fury was completely defenseless when hit with that left hook because he's already on the way down. It just kind of pushed him back, and he was spread eagle for a second, but he wasn't hurt. He was able to sit right up and come back and win the rest of the round, basically, and should have won the fight, but didn't.
So I mentioned it before in my usual, sarcastic way that after Dillian Whyte won his rematch with Alexander Povetkin and probably put Povetkin out of the sport, all things considered, that and COVID, the talk became from Eddie Hearn almost immediately that, the next super fight to make besides Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury is Dillian Whyte and Deontay Wilder. And right now, I said Dillian Whyte is the interim WBC belt, and that's the belt that the regular belt is what Deontay Wilder lost to Tyson Fury. Dillian Whyte has only 2 losses on his record. The one crazy knockout from last summer from Povetkin, and then he got beat by the current unified champion Anthony Joshua. He was TKO'd in the 7th round. But other than that, he's got some pretty notable wins. He's got 2 over Derek Chisora. He's got 1 over Joseph Parker, who's also on the come-up. He's got 1 over Marius Wach, who also had the pleasure of fighting Tyson Fury over the last couple of years. So, he's behind the top 3 guys that we're talking about. He's a star on the come-up, in the making. And I know Eddie Hearn wants to bring him to America and show him around, and and try to get and try to up his visibility and maybe win some fans stateside. How do you think Dillian Whyte, if they can make Dillian Whyte versus Deontay Wilder? And I know Deontay Wilder said when initially when he was champion he didn't want to fight Dillian Whyte, but now Deontay Wilder doesn't have a tremendous amount of cards to play, and he's got to get either retire or get back in the ring. He's got to fight somebody, and if he wants a big money fight, there's no other better person to fight than Dillian Whyte, unless he wants to take somebody lower in the rankings, kind of like Andy Ruiz, Chris Arreola type deal. So my point, my question to you is, if they can get some stateside stadium fight sometime this summer between Dillian Whyte and Deontay Wilder, how do you think the 2 of them match up?
It's an interesting fight because both guys not only have shown the propensity to be able to take guys out with one shot, but they also have the ability to take shots in return, because they've both been knocked out. It's an interesting fight because, again, I think Whyte is very underrated in his ability to fight on the inside. And if he's able to get inside of Deontay Wilder, then I think Wilder has a real big problem on his hands because he won't know what to do. We talked about the Sasha Povetkin rematch that Whyte just had, where one of the biggest differences between the two is on the inside, Whyte was either punching or getting his arms and elbows and forearms up to catch whatever Povetkin was throwing back at him, while Povetkin would try to exit, but with his hands low, and that would allow Whyte to catch him. And, yes, I understand that Povetkin was very ill coming out of a bout with COVID, so you kind of couldn't really officially expect him to be at his very best, and that's fair. But at the same time, I'm curious how much of that had to do with, technical deficiencies versus the illness itself, and that's, going to always be speculatory. We'll never officially know. But that being said, sorry, that was an annoying pop-up. That being said, I would take Whyte in that fight because I just think he's got more tools at his disposal. And again, we haven't seen anything from Wilder indicative of a style change that would benefit him or any type of making use of the things that would trouble Whyte. Whyte's only problem is, can he be drawn into chasing Wilder at long range and opening himself up for that right hand? And honestly, from the mental makeup of Wilder, I'm still questioning if he's ever going to fight again.
I haven't heard anything, It's something I tend to stay on top of. And, Robert Winfrey and I have talked about it in various commentaries and, plugs that we've done, just kind of casually talking about boxing at the end of a podcast or something. And Whyte seems very content to find people to blame his loss to Tyson Fury on, either Tyson Fury cheated in some way. The last thing is him and his coach, I think, broke up. And he accuses coach of
he
spiking
fired
his water.
Mark Radulich, who saved his life.
Yeah. So, yeah, questionable mental health, to say the least. I mean, it's a fight that I want to see, but I'm with you. I have a sneaking suspicion White catches him on the inside and ends up, at the very least, winning a decision, if not knocking Wilder out. So let's move on. Probably the most technically proficient boxer in modern times, Anthony Joshua. He has 25 fights, 24 wins, 1 loss, and that loss is to Andy Ruiz, which he immediately won his title back in 12 rounds of jabbing in Saudi Arabia. He has 22 knockouts, 2 decisions, and you said it before. In a era where the best don't always fight the best, the one with the best record, the one who has fought at least the best that he could fight outside of Tyson Fury, has been Anthony Joshua. He's beaten Dillian White twice, as we've mentioned. Once, rather. He's beaten him once. He's beaten Dominic Brazil. He beat Eric Molina. He beat Vladimir Klitschko. In fact, he TKO'd him in the 11th round, and that was his probably most high-profile win to date. And that was back in 2017. He's beaten Joseph Parker. He beat Povetkin back in 2018 by TKO in the 7th. And then he just had the one hiccup with Andy Ruiz. Have you ever gone back and watched that? Because we commentated on that live, and we both thought that Anthony Joshua did not look like himself against Andy Ruiz, and Andy Ruiz was able to knock him out in 7. I don't want to go back over some of the stuff we said at the time, but yeah, we were. It all looked very suspicious, to say the least. What are you thinking back on that, and if you've watched it ever since? What are your thoughts on the very first Andy Ruiz-Anthony Joshua fight?
I mean, the fact that we found out after the fact that he had been concussed in sparring like the week before that, and somehow was still thrown into a fight against a guy who, you can say whatever you want to say about Andy Ruiz. Andy Ruiz, for a long time as he's been around, has been known for 2 things: incredible hand speed, despite his look, his roly-poly look, and very, very powerful hands. And, it started off as a typical Joshua fight in the sense that he was technically very superior and used that to set up and score a knockdown towards and a very vicious one at that. But he got caught up with fighting on the inside against Ruiz, which is the one place you don't want to be, because you're going to allow him his best opportunity to win the fight. And when a guy like that is able to tag you, get inside and hurt you, there's a very good chance he's going to be able to finish the job no matter how tough you are. And that's what happened. And again, you said he won the rematch by 12 rounds of jabbing. Not the most fun rematch. But you have to take away the fact that, one, he was able to do that for 12 rounds. It takes an incredible level of conditioning and stamina to do that. And again, say whatever you want to say about Ruiz and his not being the body beautiful. He's a very good professional fighter. And to not have really any success other than, I believe, 2 rounds of that fight through the entirety of it, despite his big power and quick hands, is very impressive.
Yeah, Joshua, I'm not sure who had the reach advantage on this. Probably Joshua. But Joshua was able to keep Andy Ruiz at bay at the end of his jab, and Ruiz really wanted to fight on the inside. Ruiz, much like we were talking about with Dillian White, he wanted to fight on the inside. He wanted to throw hooks. He wanted to throw some big knockout punches in the phone booth, and Joshua wouldn't let him. And by the end of the fight, Ruiz was pissed, because the other thing was that Anthony Joshua was able to cut the ring off from Andy Ruiz. He was able to move around the ring. He used the space to his advantage, and Andy Ruiz would try to give chase, and it didn't work out very well, to the point where at the very end of it, Andy Ruiz was so frustrated that he was stomping his feet and standing in the middle of the ring going, "Come on, fight me here." And Anthony Joshua was like, "No. I
Come
won't."
and get me.
He's like, "Nope, not going to do that." And it was like late in the 12th round when he did it, so not like it mattered. But in your opinion, how does Anthony Joshua stack up against some of the greats of yore?
From a physical equipment standpoint, he has the physical tools to be able to fight anybody at any point in time. It's never been a question of what Anthony Joshua could do physically. It's the mental makeup of Anthony Joshua. And does he have the intelligence to be able to fight the smarter fighters of all time? Does he have the intestinal fortitude to weather storms against some of the rougher, tougher fighters of all time who would push him and test him and make him have to fight? And I think 2 fights kind of gave us our answers to that. One would be his fight with Andy Ruiz, the rematch, where did he learn from a past mistake, or was this ghost that haunts him of this knockout going to affect him and not allow him to perform at his best? It may not have been the most aesthetically pleasing performance, but it was a complete performance from Joshua, who fought exactly the fight he should have the first time in order to walk away with a win against an opponent by taking away what they were able to do successfully. The other fight, which we'll talk about, that I think showed a great deal of what Joshua's internal makeup is his fight with Vladimir Klitschko, where I think you and I and Robert actually did a watch-along on this at one point in time, because I called it one of the best action heavyweight fights of all time, because it was. He fought a great champion in Klitschko, who, again, from a physical tool standpoint, you have maybe the most aesthetically pleasing fight poster there has ever been with these two on it. Both of these guys look like they were invented in labs to be professional athletes. And what we got was a fight that had a high amount of technique, a high amount of action and violence, and honestly, both guys showing a lot of heart and intestinal fortitude, because both guys were dropped hard and hurt, and came back to fight on. So Anthony Joshua is going to be a live fight for anybody at any time. And I think the people who detract from him based on the loss to Andy Ruiz forget what he fought through against Vladimir Klitschko, forget that he took Dillian Whyte's best punches, was hurt, and came back to stop him, and has, other than one slip on a banana peel against Ruiz, been pretty consistent with beating the best guys available in the heavyweight division since he's turned professional almost a decade ago.
You know, Andrew Ruiz also no slouch. 35 fights, 33 wins, 2 losses. And those losses are, one was to Joseph Parker, and that was for the vacant WBO heavyweight title back in 2016. And then the other one was to Anthony Joshua, the second time around. You know, this fight that he has coming up May 1st against Chris Arreola is his get-well fight. You know, it's a fight to test to see if he can continue to be a pay-per-view draw. I'm actually starting to wonder if, you know, people stateside, they're trying to make a American heavyweight star, and everyone was very much wanting that to be Deontay Wilder. But if Deontay Wilder can't get his head together, his act, then I think they're looking at Andy Ruiz and saying, why not Mexican Rocky? Why not make this guy the next big star? And if he can do away with Chris Arreola without taking too much damage, and he does it in impressive fashion, I'm wondering if they're not lining him up then for if they can't get Deontay Wilder to do it, for that stateside fight with Dillian Whyte. What do you think about Andy Ruiz versus Dillian Whyte?
I think it's a great fight. I think it's a fight that is infinitely winnable, too, for both guys. As a matter of fact, I would probably favor Andy Ruiz in that, just based on stylistically how they match up, because they both like to fight in a similar manner. But I've seen Andy get hit and not get as hurt as I've seen Whyte hurt on the inside. And again, I think the biggest thing that people underrate about Andy Ruiz is incredible hand speed, especially in close. When the guy lets his hands go, it's incredible to see release and his timing on it. It's really, really nice. As long as Ruiz gets himself into shape, and if you've been following him, he looks to be working harder than he ever has before. In Canelo Alvarez's camp, he slimmed down a tremendous amount without doing it in a manner that would make you question how. He's still got body mass to him that's just going to be to his advantage when he puts that weight into his punches. But he looks like a better Andy Ruiz than he has in a long time, probably since about the time he fought Joseph Parker.
He's taller than I thought he was. He's 6'2", and I remember looking at him in the ring with Anthony Joshua where he looked so much shorter, but then Anthony Joshua's a tall drink of water. I mean,
he's 6'6", and again,
right.
Ruiz also fights more often than not out of a crouch, which is going to take some of that height away further.
Sure. Anything else about Anthony Joshua that you want to talk about before we move on?
He's one of those guys who, for whatever reason, at least in the United States, is being looked at more for what he's done wrong than what he's done right. And you're talking about a guy who has, at this point in time, beaten everybody he's ever met in a ring, the majority of them by knockouts. So I have a hard time listening to people try to poo-poo on Anthony Joshua and what he's accomplished. It's a little bit silly to me, and I dismiss a lot of it. And again, I think if you're building an ideal heavyweight, it's very hard to discount Anthony Joshua as the kind of guy you would want to build to.
I think the other thing working against Anthony Joshua is he hasn't quite found his public persona just yet. Like, I was thinking about his fight with Kubrat Pulev, and he knocked Pulev out in an impressive fashion. It was very similar in degree, in difficulty degree, with the last, like, Canelo Alvarez mandatory fight where everyone was like, but why did he have to fight this guy? And he put him away, like, really quickly. And it was embarrassing. Kubrat Pulev put on a bit more of a fight than that guy did against Canelo in February. But be that as it may, so Anthony Joshua beats Kubrat Pulev, and he does so impressively. And he's continuing sort of to get the stink of the loss to Andy Ruiz over him, and then the win, but the win in unimpressive fashion that followed. And Eddie Hearn is desperately trying to make a star out of this guy. And they put him in front of a microphone, and it's like, who are you going to fight next? And here's the thing. Like, I get the frustration on some of these guys. They come out of a fight, they've just fought somebody, and the press are like, well, who are you going to fight next? What have you done for me lately? And then some of these fighters get really frustrated by that. Like, I just fought somebody. Why are we pressuring me to fight, to talk about who I'm going to fight next? And it's like, I can't remember who said this. It was during one of the UFC fights where if you have the opportunity, if you win a fight, and then you have the opportunity to have the post-fight interview, and they're asking you who you want to fight next, have a name available. No matter how ridiculous it might be, no matter how, likely it is you're actually going to get that fight, at least put somebody out there, get people talking. And what you have more often than not is the "I'm just happy to be here" post-fight speech. My managers take care of that. That's another fun one people say. I don't know who I want to fight next. Whoever Dana White thinks I should fight next. My managers take care of that. I'm just happy to be here. And, it's hard for people to... Like, I'm not saying you have to go the Mike Tyson route of I want to eat your children. And I don't think you need to even go the silly Chael Sonnen, doing a WWE-style promo afterwards. But have some personality. And so I go back to... Anthony Joshua after the Kubrat Pulev fight, and he's sitting there, and they're asking him questions, and he just seemed like he wanted to go home. Like, I remember looking at my wife going, Anthony Joshua just does not seem like he wants to be bothered with reporters, doesn't seem like he wants to be there, and people pick up on that. And when you feel, and when it feels like you don't want to talk to the press, then it feels like you don't want to talk to the public, and if you don't want to talk to the public, why should we cheer for you? Why should we buy into you as a star? You know what I mean, Pat?
Absolutely. He did very much seem disinterested at that point, and I think, maybe it is in part some way due to the reaction to his prior two fights with Andy Ruiz, where he was kind of derided by everybody for losing the first one, and then when he won the second one in dominant fashion but didn't do it in an exciting way, he really didn't get credit for exercising any demon or beating a very good professional fighter. It was more about he fought a boring fight against the guy who came in out of shape and seemed unwilling to engage, and that wasn't, appreciated. Well, yeah, you know why he didn't engage? So that Andy Ruiz wouldn't win. Because that's how he lost the first fight.
Right.
and he seemed very, very disinterested in trying to pin down, I want this. But in Fortune, we do have, at the moment at least, a signed agreement between himself and Tyson Fury to get a truly undisputed heavyweight champion.
Yep, barring any unforeseen calamity, it's either going to be July 24th, August 31st, or August 7th. And I've tweeted Eddie Hearn on Twitter and told him that August 7th works for me, so that's the date the Saudis should pick. And I think it's actually up to the Saudis what date they want to do it. I don't see why they wouldn't listen to me. Whatever. Yeah, well, and that brings us to his opponent, Tyson Fury, who is thus far undefeated in 30 wins, 31 fights, 30 wins, 21 by knockout, and he has the one draw with Deontay Wilder. He has had some pretty decent wins on his record going into the Klitschko fight, where he won a 12-round decision and became the undisputed, undefeated, unified champion of the world. He won the WBA Super. He won everything but the WBC. The WBA Super, IBF, WBO, IBO, and the Ring, and the Lineal Heavyweight Championships on November 28th, 2015. So tell us a little bit about the Klitschko-Fury fight, Pat.
Unfortunately, we talked a few episodes back in our Ali the Final Chapter episode about the Muhammad Ali Jimmy Young fight being maybe the hardest fight you would ever have to sit through. And then Tyson Fury said, "Hold my beer." Okay. Because I remember watching this live on HBO, and it's one of those fights where you can understand everything that's happening, and you can appreciate things like tactics and intelligence, but even then at a certain point it gets horrendous to watch, and this was one of those fights. You had Fury, who really, really wanted to just confuse and frustrate Vladimir Klitschko with movement and the occasional counter shot and dictating the range, which the usually taller Klitschko was able to do, but against the 6'9" Fury, he would have to get inside of Fury's reach and range, and wasn't sure how to do that with Fury's very, very unorthodox style in this fight. Lots of leaning, posturing, hands down, quick upper body movements here and there. But again, you have a heavyweight title fight where in 12 rounds of the fight, neither guy landed double-digit punches in any round. It was a tactically very brilliant performance from Fury, but one I have never had the desire to watch again in my lifetime.
And it would also, unfortunately for Tyson Fury, he would run afoul of his own mental health issues, drugs, and any number of issues. And so he takes a 3-year hiatus, but then he comes back in June of 2018, against Sefer Seferi, who retired on the stool in 4 rounds. He makes a quick turnaround in August of 2018 against Francisco Pineda, who he stopped in 10.
No, he did not stop him. He won a decision.
He wanted it. That's what I meant, but I said stopped. Who he won a decision for in 10 rounds.
But him not getting the stoppage is largely an impetus of why his next fight happened.
Okay, talk about that.
So Fury, upon retirement, not retirement, but just taking a sabbatical, I guess is the right way to put it, to deal with all these personal issues that he had in his life. And credit to him for doing that. And, he had stuff wrong with him, and he decided, I need to step away, despite the fact that I'm probably at my biggest earning point that I'll ever be at. I need to fix me first and make sure my life is okay for the sake of my wife and my family and myself. And so he vacates the WBA, IBF, WBO, and Ring titles to step away, and he takes a few comeback fights, and he fights Seferi, who is a soft touch from Albania that he stops with minimal effort. And he fights Francesco Pineda from Italy. He doesn't look overly great doing it. He looks a little bit sluggish. He's a little bit slow. He gets punched a little more than we're used to seeing from him. and he kind of doesn't look all that great, but with his profile of having stepped away as undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, and even in his higher profile fights prior to Klitschko against, the likes of Derek Chisora, Steve Cunningham, he had shown flaws that I guess people were always clowning him on to a certain extent. Despite his size, Fury was not looked at as a tremendous puncher because he struggled. He was seen as a guy who could be hurt by lesser punchers. Take the example of Cunningham, who had been a cruiserweight champion and not known for his punching power, but dropped and hurt Fury. And, despite 2 wins over Chisora, who's a very good fighter, very powerful puncher, the Klitschko fight was seen as a watershed moment for him. But again, much like Joshua, not in a good way because he put on such a boring performance. So to come back in 2 fights and not look all that great and seem like you're still working the kinks out, if you are trying to create the next superstar, which people were trying to do with Deontay Wilder in the U.S., why not take him now before he really gets going and back on his stride and becomes a better version of Fury than we want to deal with?
Okay. So they figured this was an easy get for Deontay Wilder. It did not work out that way.
They were pretty much thinking that this was the time to capitalize on it because it's winnable for him.
Yeah. And Deontay Wilder, by all accounts, lost that fight, even though it was scored a draw by the judges. In a different world where maybe Tyson Fury doesn't get knocked down late in the fight, maybe the judges see it a little bit differently. Maybe he wins the decision that he should have in the first place. But it's neither here nor there. It happened. They got a draw. They ended up doing the rematch. We all know how that ended. But in the interim,
almost. I wonder if somebody thought it was going to end like that. That did that on a show on this network.
You're so smart. So he followed that up with a TKO over Tom Schwartz. Then a really boring decision against Otto Wallin. I remember that one distinctly, and it was like, ugh, that one made my eyes cross.
He struggled through that one because of those cuts. It was not his best hour. But, he had 2 very bad cuts in that fight over his eyes. Mm-hmm. And it was in danger of that fight being stopped due to the cuts. So he fought not necessarily as bad as Klitschko, but because he just needed to out of self-preservation more than anything.
And then the aforementioned Deontay Wilder. So, we've talked a little bit about this. We've definitely talked about this on alternative commentaries. How does Tyson Fury... technique-wise, because here's the thing. We talked about Deontay Wilder being power and no technique. We talked about Anthony Joshua being a physical specimen, probably having the best technique of the bunch, the most standard technique with power to match. Arguably the best heavyweight in the division when you think about, when you think just in pure terms of ability and talent. But then you have this wild card in Tyson Fury. You've thrown the term herky-jerky out there. He's wildly unpredictable. He is a perpetual movement machine in the ring. He has size, he has power, and it's very hard to kind of pin down his style and technique because it's so bizarre. And in one fight, he can give you a breathtaking, startling, violent performance, and in another one, he can bore you to sleep. And so, what do you make of Tyson Fury, especially compared to his predecessors?
I think from a ring intelligence level, he's operating at the highest level.
Okay.
I think he's as smart a fighter in that ring as we've ever seen. Because I think, again, if there's one thing you can take out of that Klitschko fight, it's that he was able to take away everything Vladimir could do well to win that fight. And even though the numbers on paper aren't necessarily indicative of it, Tyson Fury dominated that fight. He didn't land a ton of punches, he didn't hurt Vladimir, but he dominated the fight. And when you're able to do that against a great all-time champion, there's something about you that's very special. And so from his intelligence alone, Tyson Fury is going to pose problems when you combine that intelligence with his size and range for pretty much anybody at any time. So while he may not have the greatest resume, so to speak, whereas Joshua's beaten pretty much most of the great heavyweights of today, he's beaten the Joseph Parkers, the Dillian Whites, the Andy Ruizes, and again, Fury's resume is kind of, you look at what the best names on there are, it's Wilder, Vladimir, and Derek Chisora would probably be my pick for the third best fighter on there. It's not exactly a murderer's row. So, but you have to look, and you can take this between Wilder and Joshua and ask whose performance against Klitschko was more impressive. You have Joshua, who did go life and death with him, but eventually knocked him out. And then you have Fury, who hardly got touched by him, but also hardly touched him. So it's one of those things where who was more impressive type of thing. And I think that boils down to which Klitschko they've fought, because I do think that Joshua fought a more motivated and ready Vladimir than did Tyson Fury. So it's one of those things where it's, you're kind of splitting hairs at that point and almost going with a preference issue. But again, much in the way that Joshua has all the physical tools that would make him competitive with pretty much any heavyweight at any time, Tyson Fury's brain is going to make him competitive with any heavyweight at any time.
We're going to take a pause here and talk to you about Grammarly. For you listeners of the Heavyweight Championship Boxing Series on Radulich and Broadcasting Network, brought to you by W2M, Grammarly is offering a free download of the Grammarly software. Grammarly's AI-powered products help people communicate more effectively. Grammarly helps you write mistake-free on Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and nearly anywhere else you write on the web. Grammarly corrects hundreds of grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes while also catching contextual errors, improving your vocabulary, and suggesting style improvements. To download Grammarly today, go to getgrammarly.com/W2M network. That's getgrammarly.com/W2M network to download Grammarly for free. All right, so
thank you, Grammarly, for correcting all of the notes I sent to Mark, because without that, they would largely probably look like a 6-year-old's first homework assignment.
Yes, Grammarly, thank you. All right, so before we start to close up here and sort of looking at the rest of the heavyweight division, we're going to just touch on some of these guys. They've signed, they've got a location, we just need a date now, and we're waiting for the Saudis to figure that out. But theoretically, we are looking at Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury for all the marbles, end of July, beginning of August. Who do you like? How do you see that fight going?
Man, had you asked me a few months back, I absolutely would have leaned towards Tyson Fury by decision. His in-ring intelligence, as I've talked about, is just really, really on another level for most guys. And I tend to always bet on a guy who's going to fight smarter as long as he's physically equipped to fight. And in that instance, I think Fury checks those boxes. However, against Kubrat Pulev, I saw a very determined, very in shape, very smart Anthony Joshua. And you're looking at a Tyson Fury who's now come out and said, I think I have maybe 3 or 4 more fights left. So he's looking at the road after boxing. I haven't really heard that from Anthony Joshua. And again, I think each guy is the best guy that the other is going to have fought. I still lean towards Fury. I don't lean as strongly towards him as I would have a few months back.
Yeah, it's a tough one to call. My amateur prediction is as follows. I don't think it's going to be a great fight, to be honest with you. I think it's going to be a lot of movement, a lot of jabbing and pawing. I think there's going to end up being a lot of clinching. And I don't think either one of them is going to get off a lot of power shots. I think Anthony Joshua is going to try to definitely avoid Tyson Fury. And because Tyson Fury is not exactly like a tremendously aggressive fighter, I think it's going to be a lot of defensive fighting on both. And I think one of them is going to end up eking out a decision. And I think I think a lot of people are going to be really disappointed when this fight happens. I think it's a fight that needs to happen. It's a fight that I'm excited about. I've already talked about, like, if it happens on the day that I'm working, I'm not going to work that day. If it happens while I'm traveling, I'll end up just watching it on my phone. I'm not unexcited for this fight. I just, they say styles make fights. This is a weird styles clash to me. What do you think about that?
I don't know that we're going to see the aggressive Tyson Fury that we saw against Deontay Wilder. I think that would be a mistake for Fury. Because at that point, then you're looking at the potential of getting into a firefight with, to me, a guy who hits harder in Joshua and puts punches better together in Joshua. Even if there's the potential you can hurt him, I still don't think Fury is as big a puncher as the Wilder fights would lead you to believe. And I don't think getting into a firefight against a guy like Joshua is a smart play for Fury the way it is for an Andy Ruiz. I think Fury's best bet is to fight him the way he fought Vladimir and utilize a lot of herky-jerky upper body movement, feints, and really try to confuse him and slow the pace down as much as possible, where it's very much a pick-and-peck type of fight like you're afraid is going to happen. I think that type of fight plays best to Tyson Fury. I think the more sustained action you see, it's likely to favor the guy who, to me, is the better conditioned athlete in better shape, which is Anthony Joshua, who traditionally is in fights with higher output levels than is Fury. I don't question Tyson Fury's level of stamina. I do question his ability to sustain a pace on par with Anthony Joshua if he needed to for any length of time based on their respective training regimens and styles of fighting.
All right, so let's see how the rest of the division plays out here. I have the Ring Magazine heavyweight rankings in front of me here. Of course, Tyson Fury is seen as champion. Number 1 behind him is Anthony Joshua. Number 2 behind him is Deontay Wilder. We've talked about all three of those guys. Then we have Dillian White at number 3. We have Luis Ortiz, who we talked about, at number 4. And the first guy that we've mentioned, but we haven't really talked about, is Joseph Parker. Joseph Parker was last seen in a nondescript kind of blah fight in a headliner down in New Zealand at the Spark Arena on February 27th, 2021 on DAZN. He took on Junior Fa, and it was a unanimous decision. He won the vacant WBO Oriental heavyweight title. He has 28 wins, 2 losses, 21 knockouts, and those 2 losses are decision losses to the aforementioned Dillian White and Anthony Joshua. So when he loses, he at least loses to the best. This is another guy on the come-up. This is another guy they're trying to make a star out of. He has a fight against Derek Chisora, and presumably a winnable fight against Derek Chisora on May 1st. So what's your opinion, in 50 words or less, on Joseph Parker?
Very good fighter, underrated in certain respect because of who he's lost to. Really very, very close fight against White where he knocked him down at the very end of the fight and could have gone either way in many respects. We'll see how he can rebound if he's able to land a big fight because I think he deserves it. Again, aside from those losses, he put together 4 wins, one of which against Alex Lapai, who's a former title challenger. He's also beaten Tyson's little brother Huey. So we'll see if he ever gets a shot up in the upper echelon. He technically is in the running to fight the winner of Alexander Usyk and oh God, why am I blanking? We just mentioned this. Yes, we just mentioned that earlier at the top of the show. He is technically in line to fight for the WBO title at whoever wins that fight. Unless, again, there's a whole unification issue again. But by virtue of his last win, he deserves that right. And again, he's a very good fighter. He beat Andy Ruiz. He beat Yui Fury. He's beaten other guys like Alexander Dimitrenko and Carlos Takam. Talented guy with a lot of skills. He's not necessarily outstanding in any one respect, but he's a very tough guy to finish off because no one's been able to do it. And that if he comes in and fights his fight, he's got the ability to beat the best of the best.
Coming in behind him is Andy Ruiz at number 6. I think is a bit low, but okay. And then we have Michael Hunter. Michael Hunter is a cruiserweight and a heavyweight. He last had a win over Sean Lowry December 18th, 2020. In Texas, he KO'd him in 4 rounds. Before that, he drew with Povetkin. He has 1 loss on his record at junior heavyweight, and that is against Alexander Usyk. His current record is 19-1-1 with 13 knockouts. And I don't know what's on the horizon for Michael Hunter. What's your opinion on the man?
Big fan of Mike the Bounty Hunter Jr. Was a big fan of his dad, who was a real character back on the network TV boxing days. One of those guys who had all the potential and talent in the world but didn't always work his way into using it. But Mike Jr. is a very hard worker. Fought Usyk for the cruiserweight title and came up short like everybody else who's fought Usyk. But it was a good fight, and he actually really did test Usyk at points. He's looked good as a heavyweight. He, had that really entertaining draw with Sasha Povetkin that a lot of people felt could have gone either way. Both guys looked pretty good. Came back with a quick knockout. He's very good technically. The biggest issue for Mike is that he's somewhat undersized at 6'2", and formerly being able to make the cruiserweight limit. So he's going to have to find ways to win against the bigger guys in the land of the giants, like a Tyson Fury, like an Anthony Joshua, and even guys of comparable height like Andy Ruiz. He gives away a significant amount of size to, which is always going to be troubling for him. So we'll see if he's able to make technical adjustments the way that it's thought that somebody like Alexander Usyk can in order to succeed at that level.
We talked about Alexander Povetkin. He's probably retired at this point, but he's currently number 8 in their rankings. Then there's Oscar Rivas at number 9, who has an upcoming fight on June 18th for the inaugural WBC Bridgerweight title.
Ugh.
Yeah, did we just so we can get this off your chest here, was the Bridgerweight weight class really necessary?
No. Do you know the whole story behind this?
No, tell us the story, Pat.
So a couple years ago, or actually last year at this point, there was a news story that was made very popular where a young boy named Bridger Walker saved his 4-year-old sister, who was being attacked by a stray dog. And Bridger, very, very unfortunately, lost his life by doing this. He was 6 years old at the time. And so what this is it's going to be for fighters weighing 200 pounds to 224 pounds, which that weight class is seen as considered, how should I say this, as the bridge from cruiserweight to heavyweight, because you start to see guys, if they move up from cruiserweight, moving up to that heavyweight weight, but putting on weight progressively, going from probably around 200 pounds. In their next fight, they might come in at 207, 208, and start to put on a little more body mass to be able to compete with those heavyweights.
Terrific. Well, Oscar Rivas, he has 28 fights, 27 wins, only 1 loss, and then lost to the aforementioned Dillian White for the WBC interim heavyweight title, and that was July 20th, 2019. He lost the decision. He's already beaten Bryant Jennings once. He beat him by TKO in the 12th back in 2019. And they are fighting for the inaugural WBC Bridgerweight title, as I said, June 18th this year at a location to be determined. What do you think of Oscar Rivas?
Rivas is pretty quick-handed. I think that's what's most stood out to me is watching him fight. He was able to beat Bryant Jennings really by just beating him to the punch repeatedly. He actually has a lot of experience with the other guys in the top 10 as an amateur because he's fought both Michael Hunter and Andy Ruiz as amateurs. He lost to Hunter and he beat Andy in an Olympic qualifier. And he also beat Kubrat Pulev as an amateur. So he's seen a lot of these guys already at that level, but as a pro, he hasn't gotten a ton of experience against them yet. His biggest profile fights have come in his last two of his last three, where, again, he knocked out Jennings in the last round of their fight, which that was a great win. Brian Jennings is a former world title challenger, very tricky guy out of Philadelphia. Fought White, went the distance with the very hard punching White, came up a little bit short. So we'll see what he has to offer this time against Bryant, a guy of similar size, but a little bit slower. And usually, if you fight a guy in a rematch who you've knocked out, you go in with a mental edge. We'll see if that plays out this time. But Rivas is one of those guys who doesn't do anything outstanding to me that makes me believe that he's going to make a big wave in the heavyweight division. I don't say that dismissively. I just haven't seen it from him yet. It doesn't mean it's not there.
Another guy they're trying to make a big star out of, and they are who's jumped from cruiserweight to heavyweight. He comes in number 10 in the rankings. He has been making a lot of noise. He was named mandatory for one of Joshua's belts, and they are trying to get him to fight Joyce instead of sort of a step aside money and step aside fight. Quit blocking the super fight. Just here, have this fight instead. And that is Alexander Usyk. Alexander Usyk cleaned out the cruiserweight division. His last fight was against Tony Bellew in that division, where he KO'd him in 8, retaining the WBA Super, WBC, IBF, WBO, and Ring Cruiserweight titles, at which point he made the jump to heavyweight, and he was supposed to fight Tyrone Spong, but Tyrone Spong pissed hot, and that fight was subsequently canceled. Instead, he took on journeyman Joyce fighter Chaz Witherspoon, who he beat up for seven rounds and finally knocked out in Chicago on October 12, 2019. And then he took on Derek Chisora, and that was on Halloween night in 2020 for the WBO Intercontinental Heavyweight title. And, he got beat up pretty good by Chisora. He ended up eking out the decision. It was one of those where if Derek Chisora, maybe a bit younger, a bit better, might have knocked Alexander Usyk out, but instead Alexander Usyk fought defensively, he fought technically, he fought well, and he was able to evade a lot of Derek Chisora's power, and he was able to get to a decision win. Wasn't the most entertaining of fights I've ever seen, but it's the fight that made him mandatory, for what that's worth. So, Alexander Usyk, your thoughts?
I think Usyk in that fight did what a lot of people maybe aren't aware of, what he did stylistically for a lot of his fights in the cruiserweight division. Usyk is a guy who's big on playing the long game. When he has a high knockout percentage, but largely his knockouts come around 7, 8, 9 rounds into the fight because he breaks guys down over time. And Chisora was a guy who he felt would come at him very strong, very early, but not be able to sustain it. And that's really how the fight played out for the most part, is Chisora came at him very hard, very early, and hit him with his best shots possible. But, Usyk weathered the storm, made technical adjustments to avoid those rushes, and started making Chisora miss more frequently, to the point where late in the fight, Chisora was looking very bad in rounds 8, 9, 10. Came with a real second win towards the end of the fight, but just didn't have enough left to do anything with it. And by that point, Usyk had taken, real control of the fight, enough to win a pretty clear decision, though Chisora definitely had his moments in it. Usyk's one of those guys who, if he's going to be successful as a heavyweight, it's going to be largely from his technical ability and his ability to adjust. And to me, he's going to at some point have to fight a large heavyweight. He's going to have to fight a guy who's in that 6'5", 6'6" range to see how he does just in dealing with that length. Usyk is not a small guy. He's 6'3", but when you're talking about heavyweight champions who range in height from 6'6" to 6'7" to 6'9", it's a different world than where you come from.
It's a different world. Lastly, before we close out for the night, I just want to talk about Joe Joyce. Not in the top 10, but he's on the come up. He had a big win over Daniel Dubois on November 28th, 2020 at the Church House in London, where he won the British Commonwealth and WBC Silver, WBO International, and vacant European heavyweight titles. I think that was a fight where it was expected that Daniel Dubois was actually going to win it, but he got the KO in the 10th round, and now that they're talking about matching him up with Alexander Usyk. He's undefeated, 12-0. He has a decision over Bryant Jennings. He's got a KO over Alexander Ustinov, KO over Berman Severn. And so you think there's big things ahead for Joe Joyce? What do you think?
The future certainly looks bright. He's got an Olympic pedigree, coming in as a silver medalist. The Dubois fight, to me, again, both guys came into that fight undefeated, and like you said, a lot of people were really on the Dubois hype train, but Joyce just worked behind this really, really beautiful jab that made the difference in that fight, to the point where, Joyce was able to force him to take a knee just because he couldn't see punishment coming from that eye being shut by the jab, and just really doing a paint job on him. And now, unlike some of the other guys we've talked about, Joyce does have that size and height and length in order to compete with the big boys immediately. The only problem for Joe Joyce is he got a late start to the game where he's already 35 years old. So on the one hand, he hasn't necessarily been subject to the punishment that some of the other guys have through their careers, but as a professional, is he developed enough at 35 where his age is not going to start catching up to him and preventing him from being able to make these adjustments that you would need as you get more experience? To me, with Joe Joyce, they're going to have to strike hard within the next 2 years to get him into that title picture and get him a fight before age starts to catch up with him a little bit, and perhaps the reflexes, speed, and timing start to decline with that age.
All right, and the rest of the major heavyweights are as follows. We have Robert Hillenius, who's the current WBA Gold Heavyweight Champion. His last win was March 7th of 2020 against Adam Kanaki, and that, I believe,
big upset win there for Hillenius.
Yeah, and that was on one of those PBC primetime cards. We have Tony Yoka, who just fought on ESPN in the middle of the day. He had a big win over Joel Jecko, and that was March 5th of 2021. He's 10-0. The aforementioned Kubrat Pulev, who just had a loss to Anthony Joshua. Charles Martin, who they were talking about as a big star, but hasn't fought in over a year. He's the number 2. He's the IBF number 2 heavyweight contender. He had a big win, as I said before, on February 22nd, 2020, TKO against Gerald Washington, but we haven't heard from him since. And so he's another one who needs to get out there and get a fight going and make a name for himself.
Former title holder.
Yep. Philip Hurgrovich, he's the WBC International Heavyweight Champion. He's 12-0, and he just fought in November. He had a TKO over Rydell Booker down here in Florida.
God, Rydell Booker's still fighting, huh?
At least he was in November. So he's another one who needs to get busy. The aforementioned Derek Chisora, Adam Kanaki, who had that loss against Robert Hillenius. We haven't seen anything from him since. Up-and-comer F.A. Ajagba is the WBC number 11 heavyweight contender from Nigeria. He's 15-0 with 12 KOs, and he just TKO'd Brian Howard on April 10th of 2021 in the 3rd round. So, he just fought, but it would be not literally within 2 weeks ago. So hopefully he gets back in the ring soon. And then coming in at number 20 is Martin Bakole from the Congo, and he's 16-1, and he had a win in December 12th of 2020 against Sergey Kuzmin, and that was over there in England. And then it just kind of goes on like that. Weirdly enough, they were talking about Aji Kabiel as a mandatory for the WBC belt, and late last year they were talking about him versus Tyson Fury. He's number 23 in these overall rankings that I'm looking at, and his last win was July 18th of 2020. And he's 20-0, so I guess that's where they're coming from with that. But you think he'd be ranked higher? To be,
yeah, but rankings are a funny and subjective thing, as we know, Mark.
They certainly are, Ollie. We were talking about Daniel Dubois before. He actually has a fight coming up June 5th against Bogdan Dinu.
Be interesting to see how he rebounds after that fight to Joyce, because with the eye injury he took in that one, very easy to see a lot of guys who don't come back the same after that. And if he's able to come back and look good, that's even better. And I hope that's the kind of guy we see.
So I've mentioned pretty much everybody I think there is to talk about in the heavyweight division. Is there anyone on your mind that we haven't talked about that we would be remiss if we didn't bring up?
No, we went through the heavy hitters, we went through the prospects, we went through pretty much I think everybody who we should cover at this point in time.
All right, so the big question here, what have we learned? You know, if you're selling somebody, you know, if you think about like the ages of boxing that we covered over time, you have, you know, you sell the people on the Jack Johnson era of boxing of, oh, this is where boxing comes from. This, you know, everything that we know about modern boxing starts here, and these are good fights to watch to understand what are boxing's beginnings. And then you look at the 20s through the 50s, and you see, you know, how the sport evolved and how it developed, and there were some of the greats that took, you know, that fought during this time. You have your Rocky Marcianos and your Ezra Charles and all of that. And then you have the golden age of boxing, which is, you know, your mid to late 50s into your 60s and 70s. And it's the one that everyone kind of points to and says, boy, if there's ever an era, if you have to pick one and everything else has to go, that's the era that you keep. You know, there's your Ali, your Fraziers, your Foremans, your Jerry Quarries, Old Velvet Pants, you know, and all of that. And then we have sort of the bleak period of the 80s, but then you have Tyson, right? You have Tyson, and then Holyfield and Lennox Lewis. And then there's the Klitschko era, as we talked about in the last podcast. So if you're selling somebody on modern times, right, you're saying there's all these great eras of boxing. Every era has something to offer in telling you the story and telling you the tale. There's something to be gained from studying each one of these eras. What do you sell people on for modern times? You know, what's good about boxing today?
You know, especially in the era of pandemic, where for a long time we didn't get fights, and then sure enough, we didn't get fights that were really mattering into the landscape. If I'm selling you today on a heavyweight championship and the heavyweights themselves, my selling points are Tyson Fury with his bombastic character, calling people out with "you big dosa," and his post-fight celebrations, where even if he doesn't perform at the most exciting level, like maybe he has a performance like against Otto Wallin, which was a very tough fight to sit through, but was necessary for him. He is an incredible fight salesman with his ability to verbalize and visualize things the way he does with his size and his look and his kind of personality. If I want to sell you on a guy who's a heavyweight destroyer who knocks people out, despite his performance against Andy Ruiz in their second fight, I'm going to show you a highlight video of Anthony Joshua, because the first thing you're going to say when you look at this guy physically is wow, because this guy looks like an Adonis in the same vein as a Holyfield or a Mike Weaver, and hits like a wrecking ball and does so putting beautiful combinations together and looks like what you would envision this perfect heavyweight champion to be. If you were visualizing the heavyweight champion of the world for a boxing movie, this is who you would see, is Anthony Joshua. And even though he doesn't have a personality like Tyson Fury, in many respects it's a good contrast because of what he does in the ring. If you want the casual fan who's just a regular blue-collar guy sitting on a bar stool drinking a Bud Diesel, you show him the first Andy Ruiz-Anthony Joshua fight. Because who's not going to root for the frumpy fat guy who just wants to go in there and throw hands with somebody?
Right.
So when you have your selling points, those are the three big ones automatically, because you could have gone to Deontay Wilder pre-Tyson Fury rematch, but he's done so much damage to himself and his public image with how he has handled things after that fight, and to some extent during that fight, to be fair, but largely his excuse-making and finger-pointing after that fight, that nobody wants to touch him.
Last question, and then we'll wrap up. Where do you rank modern times versus the Tyson era, the Golden Age, mid-20th century, and the early days?
I think that we're a pretty far cry away from the, Lewis Holyfield Tyson Bowe era. I think we're a pretty far cry away from the era of Ali Frazier, Foreman, Holmes, Norton, Quarry, Bonavena, Cooney, etc. I think we're a far cry away from that. I think we're at a better place than we were during Dokes, Weaver, Witherspoon, Carl, and then the Lost Sons of the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're probably at a level that's maybe comparable to, say, the Joe Louis era, where there are some smatterings of goodness here and there, but there's a one guy on top who's so much better than everybody else. And in that instance, we're going to find out who that guy is between Joshua and Fury coming up in the summertime, because that guy's going to be the clear, far and away front runner of this era. And everybody else, while there's some good guys, there was just one guy up at the top that couldn't be touched. And I think we're probably in a similar state to that, because, again, you look at some of the champions of the past who were active during the Lewis era. You've got your Jim Braddocks, your Jack Sharkeys, your Primo Carneras. Not exactly the greatest reflection of the heavyweight title in terms of who they were and how they fought.
All right. I think that's where we're going to end things. Before we do, I want to remind everybody that we have a link to AmazonMusic.com. AmazonMusic.com is giving away a free 30 days of Amazon Music. You can check out all of the albums that we review on the Metal Hammer of Doom. We just actually reposted one of our very early Metal Hammer of Doom shows before it was called as such, where we reviewed the Death Clock Death Album 3. That's on Amazon Music. Most of the albums that we review are there. You can click our link, get a free 30 days, and stream all the music that you want. Pat, this has been a very educational series. People have seemed to enjoy it, and so we're going to keep going. We're going to make this a regular part of the podcast lineup. How do you feel about that?
Yay, more work for free. Yay.
That's the best kind.
Although I will say, since we just brought up Amazon Music, I was at a friend's house last night who is an Amazon Music subscriber, and while we're talking and slamming down some Wild Rose bourbon, I mentioned about how I had just watched this movie Rapid Fire with Brandon Lee, and how one of my favorite songs is in that movie, but I never hear it ever outside of that movie. It's called Can't Find My Way by Hardline, which plays over a love scene between Brandon Lee and the girl in the movie, and I just think it's an awesome song, and I think it's a pretty odd thing to love, because it's a love scene interspersed with, like, a jail assassination, but whatever, it's fine, it's awesome, it's Brandon Lee and Rapid Fire. But as soon as I said that, her Alexa picked up on the song and started playing it, and I was like, this is a good service.
Perfect. Well, the next time Pat and I are getting together will be for the Mania of WrestleMania 2, and we'll be joined by Chris Bailey. That'll be a mid-afternoon recording on May 10th. And then the History of Boxing podcast will continue, as I've said, in our first episode, where we'll be looking at the various people's places and things throughout the history of boxing. We're going to start with the Fab Four, featuring the late marvelous Marvin Hagler. Did you see the thing I sent you? I think it was like a framed cover of something that he was, like a Ring magazine. Did you see the link I sent you?
Yeah, they're starting bidding on that for Oscar De La Hoya to make more money to buy cocaine.
Perfect. So we have Roberto Duran, marvelous Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, and Thomas Hearns. So we'll talk about those
USSA, four. Baby!
We'll talk about those four, and then we'll keep going from there. And that's going to be May 27th. All right.
Yeah, so just to start that series, to let everybody know, we're going to introduce you per episode to each one of the four kings and their career prior to the start of the meetings between the four that encompass the entire decade of the 80s. We start with Leonard Duran 1 in June of 1980, and we end with Leonard Duran 3 in December of 1989. And largely it's those four guys and their rivalry that shaped boxing in the 80s and what many consider the last true great era of pound-for-pound fighting.
And we'll be looking forward to that. All right, in the meantime, this past week I mentioned the Death Clock album that we did. We also reviewed Umbrella Academy Season 2. We did a comic strip for the book and the movie Jiu-Jitsu. We reviewed Umbrella Academy Volume 2 Dallas. I re-aired my Spock trilogy with Jason Offit. Tomorrow, with Mortal Kombat coming out, Jesse is releasing his conversation with Jason Teasley from back in the day over the YouTube series Mortal Kombat Legacy, and it's Flashback Friday, so therefore there's another Damn You Hollywood from 2013 with me and Jeff Harris, where we reviewed The Wolverine from that year. And then on Saturday is our re-release of The Long Road to Ruin for the X-Men trilogy, X-Men X2, United, and X-Men 3 The Last Stand. Sunday is the Oscars. That's April 25th. We'll be re-releasing our On Trial Civil Court edition, where we debated who should have won the 1995 Best Picture Oscar, Forrest Gump or The Shawshank Redemption. So that'll be available to listen to April 25th.
How is that even a debate? Good Lord. You got one movie about this guy's tumultuous life and the adventures through the prison system and everything that goes on, and then you get a retard being emotionally abused for 3 decades by some horrible bitch.
I think I took up for Forrest Gump. That shouldn't surprise you at all.
No, it really doesn't.
On Monday, myself, Jesse Starcher, and Robert Winfrey will be reviewing...
Titanium. Like the space shuttle.
We'll be reviewing...
Don't let your bride touch the grass barefoot, Forrest. She'll kill it.
Ruby Rose Morgan Freeman movie, Vanquish. Christine and I will be reviewing Mortal Kombat X Volume 1, Blood Ties. Tuesday is the Damn You Hollywood for Mortal Kombat. Plus, Chris Bailey and I will be reviewing Impact Rebellion featuring Kenny Omega versus Rich Swann, title for title. Wednesday night is we're back on the Metal Hammer of Doom, where we're looking at all 3 Mortal Kombat soundtracks. And then Thursday, the 29th, myself and Sean will be doing a non-trial for the 1995 Mortal Kombat movie. Friday, because Without Remorse will be dropping on Amazon, we will be re-releasing our Long Road to Ruin for the Jack Ryan series, which was The Hunt for Red October, Patriot Games, and Clear and Present Danger. And then Saturday, Jesse's dropping a syndicated source material, What If Spider-Man Had Joined the Fantastic Four. That's it. That's all my plugs, and I know Pat doesn't do any recordings with any other people.
Mark, did you mention that Lieutenant Dan met his wife and when they were actually in Nam, and she was giving them something that looked like important maps?
Lieutenant Dan, you ain't got no legs. Are you lined up to do any of the trivia shows just yet?
I don't know what trivia shows are happening, to be honest.
I think they're doing the first one the night of the next Canelo fight. That was the last I'd heard.
Oh, so probably not for that.
Yeah, that's why I'm bailing out of that one. But yeah, we might be on a trivia show sometime in the near future. All right, folks.
Let me know what trivia it is, and I might join in there.
All right, sounds good. All right, folks. Look for
is there one about retards getting emotionally abused for 3 decades by terrible women who only come to them when they are destitute with a child?
You have a real issue with Forrest Gump, don't you?
This is my fat wife, Susan.
Thank you for joining us on the History of Boxing podcast.
I can bury her in the backyard next to Jenny with a backhoe.
For Pat Mullin, and Forrest Gump, and Jen A., who are like peas and carrots, be well, be safe, and behave.